Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Israel orders Palestinians to evacuate Rafah.
Around 100,000 Palestinian civilians have been told to evacuate as Israel appears poised to launch a new operation there.
The invasion seems closer than ever, despite months of intense ceasefire negotiations. So, why isn't there an agreement? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. So let's just start with the past few days. Over the weekend, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected a deal that would end the war. Both Israel and Hamas blamed the other side. On Sunday, Israel closed Al Jazeera's offices.
An unprecedented sight. Israeli police raid Al Jazeera's workspace in occupied East Jerusalem.
Now the network's operations continue in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. On Monday, the Israeli military ordered Palestinians in Gaza to evacuate eastern Rafah, the last refuge that has already come under bombardment.
There have been reports of heavy bombardment of Rafah by the Israeli army.
And later in the day Monday, Hamas leadership told Al Jazeera it was agreeing to a proposed ceasefire deal.
We're breaking into our regular programming with breaking news here. A leading Hamas official has told Al Jazeera that the group has now accepted a ceasefire proposal put forward by Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Mediators have been scrambling to negotiate a ceasefire deal as Israel threatens an offensive in Gaza's southern city of Rafah. No later than this
The news sent cheers through Gaza's streets.
Now, people right now here are so happy, and there's a great sense of optimism among them as they are chanting that it's time right now for return. It's time right now for a ceasefire. That is right now the situation in Rafah, this area that has been widely attacked since the early hours of this morning. Now, what we do
But there was also a message from Israel's prime minister that the operation in Rafah will continue.
We will enter Rafah because we have no other choice.
To sort through what happened with these talks over the weekend, we're talking to Willem Marx, who's been reporting for Al Jazeera.
I'm a freelance journalist who quite frequently over the last year has worked for Al Jazeera based in Israel and the Palestinian territories.
We spoke with him before the Hamas announcement. So let's talk about the negotiations going on in Cairo. Can you give us a sense of what this negotiation actually looks like? I mean, who's been in the room and what the current deal on the table is?
So this is one of dozens of rounds of conversations that's taken place over the last few months, often in Cairo, sometimes in Doha, involving essentially a very small number of people, almost exclusively men. And what the process looks like varies very slightly, but essentially you have officials from both of the two negotiating sides, that's Israel and Hamas, talking to mediators. That could be the Qataris, the Egyptians, or the Americans. And they are essentially relaying proposals and counter-proposals back and forth over many hours, days, weeks, and now months. And so the latest round of talks in Cairo.
Hamas delegation is in Cairo to meet mediators from Egypt and Qatar. CIA Director William Burns is also there.
You would have the Egyptians as the hosts. You'd often have American officials, including on this most recent occasion, the head of the CIA, William Burns. They would be trying to help facilitate a compromise, to find positions that are amenable to both Hamas and the Israeli government. And that has proven to be a really, really intractable process, which is why it's gone on for so long without there being a deal.
Well, let's talk about the deal and maybe the major sticking points for both Israel and Hamas.
Very simply, Hamas would like to see this war end and its own political and indeed military survival in Gaza. And Israel would like to get its hostages back, but doesn't want to give up on the idea that it can still destroy Hamas.
Right.
At least militarily, if not physically. And so again and again and again, Hamas has vetoed proposals that have said, well, we as Israel want to give a break to the fighting, but we want to be able to come back with our military forces and destroy you. And Hamas has said, well, we're not going to give up the valuable captives that we have that gives us leverage in these negotiations unless we know that this is eventually going to lead to an end to this conflict and our survival.
Let me just see if I've got this. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire and they want the Israelis to withdraw from Gaza. Israel wants the hostages, but they won't agree to a permanent ceasefire.
And what's been challenging for the mediators, many of them seasoned professional diplomats or intelligence officials, is trying to find language that would give Hamas sufficient trust in the possibility that the conflict could end more permanently, while giving Israel what it feels like is the wiggle room that it won't be seen as reneging on a deal if it does indeed continue to try and operate in Gaza against Hamas.
So that makes it very difficult.
It does. And so a lot of the other details that you and other listeners, I'm sure, will have heard about over the last few months around prisoner exchanges whereby Israeli captives held by Hamas and potentially other groups inside Gaza are exchanged in return for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. The mechanics by which Israeli forces would move through the Gaza Strip and potentially reduce their presence there, those are, while important, not at the crux of this very, very difficult set of conversations. Because ultimately, all of those details may or may not change, but this central tenet of Hamas that they want to survive and of Israel that they want Hamas destroyed cannot be very easily explained away.
Right. One issue that I found surprising is that Israel hasn't even sent a team.
The Israelis have yet to send their delegation. It's not clear when that will happen.
The U.S. is sort of acting as its proxy. I remember former U.S. diplomat and commentator Aaron David Miller used to call the U.S. Israel's lawyer. And that really seems to be more explicit than ever. Does not having Israel on one side of the table make this more difficult for the negotiators, do you think?
Not necessarily. It may well be, and it's not clear because so much of this is shrouded in opacity and mystery because of the way that the two sides and the multiple mediators communicate with the outside world about what's happening. But it may be that Israel has made the latest offer that it's prepared to accept. It's set down its latest set of parameters or red lines, if you will, and it doesn't feel the need to be there in the room while the mediators continue those conversations and see where Hamas feels it can accept some of those parameters. They've said, this is what we're willing to offer. We're not coming there because there's no point. We're not going to change that offer. And so often it's a reflection more about where Israel has put forward its position as opposed to its willingness to continue conversations. That would potentially happen in yet another round down the road. If Hamas is not happy with the red lines that Israel has set this time round, Israel would have to go back within its political process, within the cabinet, within endless conversations to figure out, well, what are our new red lines that get us closer to Hamas? And the mediators in the room, although they're often empowered to a certain degree, one of the big challenges has been understanding what the mandate is of those mediators on behalf of what is frankly a very fractured Israeli government.
Yeah, talking about the fractured Israeli government, pressure is mounting.
Thousands taking over the streets of Tel Aviv, demanding the government reach a deal with Hamas to bring the hostages back home.
Do you get the sense, though, that this government is feeling like direct pressure to move?
There's certainly huge amounts of pressure domestically from the families of those held captive in Gaza and many other Israelis concerned about their safety and their long-term fate. But the challenge is for Netanyahu, who is the prime minister in Israel, and some of the other senior leadership in Israel, is that there are different factions inside the government. Israel as a government is not a monolith, just as Hamas as an organization is not a monolith. There are different people with different expectations and different aims and objectives. And so one of the great challenges in these negotiations is not just negotiations between two sides via mediators to make it more complicated. There are ongoing negotiations inside the Israeli cabinet, inside the Israeli government, as there are within Hamas, where different factions of the group have different views about what may be most effective and what may be most useful.
After the break, Israel bans Al Jazeera.
If you're watching this pre-recorded report, then Al Jazeera has been banned in the territory of Israel.
Willem, what about this decision to shut down Al Jazeera's news operations inside Israel?
They've banned our website, including anything that has the option of accessing the website. The website is now inaccessible.
I mean, here you have the Qataris who own Al Jazeera playing a pivotal role in the ongoing hostage negotiations, and suddenly the Israeli government starts raiding offices. Just in terms of the negotiations, the timing couldn't be worse, could it?
This is something that members of the coalition inside Israel have expressed concern about in terms of the timing. The Qataris have been one of the few governments on earth that Hamas as a group is prepared to talk to and seems to have a two-way trust relationship with. And for the Qataris as a government potentially to feel put out by the idea that its state-owned broadcaster is being discredited will not necessarily endear the Israeli government and some of the officials involved in that decision to the Qataris, but they may feel, and again, this is pure speculation because we don't get to hear from these officials very often in public, but they may feel that they don't want to have as direct a line of communication with the Israelis. And to be clear, they've not had a very direct one. That's the role of the Egyptians and the Americans in particular, is to essentially stand between Qatar and Israel. So you get this kind of chain of communication to get from what a Hamas official says to what an Israeli official says, and it passes through Qatar, Egypt, and the United States.
Okay, so I wonder if we might widen the lens just a touch, because the stakes of reaching a deal here are enormous. Hovering over all of this is the possible invasion of Rafah, which is the southernmost city in Gaza where thousands of internally displaced people are sheltering in tents, most of them.
The southern Gaza city was supposed to be a safe place where more than 1 million Palestinians have taken refuge there after fleeing from other areas.
Willem, what happens if a deal can't be reached and Israel goes ahead with its military operation in Rafah?
This is something that again and again, the Israeli government, and particularly Netanyahu, has threatened to do. If these talks collapse, they will continue with their actions in Gaza with, one assumes, is going to be quite a significant amount of military forces.
The Israeli military dropped leaflets urging people in parts of eastern Rafah to evacuate immediately. The defense minister earlier told troops to expect intense action in Rafah.
The challenge for the Israeli forces is that Hamas is very likely well entrenched within both the buildings and the population there in Rafah. The challenge for the Israeli government is that the damage for civilians there will be substantial, and it's something that both the US, many other countries, and the United Nations repeatedly have said they have serious concerns about. We would have to presume that the Israeli military would call, as they seem to have already started to do in some parts of Rafah, for civilians to move out the way, and you would then have yet another mass displacement inside the Gaza Strip, where there's very, very few good options for civilians to find shelter, to find safety, to find food. We have heard now from the head of the World Food Programme at the UN, Cindy McCain, that famine is moving from the north of Gaza further south. So if these people are forced from the south of Gaza further north, that will lead to yet more conditions around scarcity of food, and potentially not just the death of civilians inside military operation areas, but also from famine.
The short answer is many, many more people will die.
It would seem that way.
So we're spending all of this time talking about a deal for just a ceasefire. But in many ways, that's the easy part, because all you have to do is put down your guns to get a ceasefire. The real work is going to come after that. I'm sort of shocked at how little I'm hearing answers to these very basic questions about what comes next. Who will be in charge? Who will rebuild? Who will administer aid and food? Have there been answers floated to any of these basic questions?
In terms of the long-term future, that is really, as you say, anybody's guess in some ways. Some interesting data points would include the fact that Hamas and officials from Fatah, which is the opposing political party, they are the individuals that run the Palestinian Authority that's responsible largely for the semi-autonomous occupied West Bank territory. Those two parties have been having conversations, both in Moscow and in Beijing in recent months. That would indicate that there may be a possibility that they would work together in Gaza, but that's not clear. The aid situation, you've seen this huge effort by the US military and others to try and expand the maritime corridor, but there are still massive challenges around humanitarian access into Gaza, crossings being closed when rockets are fired on them around Kerem Shalom, one of the major crossings. There is no clarity on how the rebuilding of Gaza would be funded. Who would be responsible for the boring, mundane politics of water access, let alone the very contentious questions around security. The Israelis in the past have said they would want to maintain security control of Gaza, but that may not be something that Palestinian leaders inside Gaza, outside Gaza, Arab countries across the region would feel comfortable with after what they've seen over the last few months. So there's a huge, huge uncertainty about what this looks like and when indeed we get to that point.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Khaled Soltan and Sarí el-Khalili, with Amy Walters, Ashish Malhotra, Chloe K. Lee, David Enders, Fahrinisa Campana, Nagin Oliayi, Tabish Talib, Catherine Nouhan, Menahil Naveed, Sonia Bagat, Zaina Badr, Tamara Kondaker, and me, Kevin Hirten, in for Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer. And Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.